Hi, I'm Tyson Franklin, and welcome to this week's episode of the Podiatry Legends Podcast. The podcast designed to help you feel, see, and think differently about the podiatry profession. With me today is Dr. Ben Pearl. He is a sports podiatrist from Arlington Foot and Ankle in Virginia, USA. Now, if you recognize the name, he has been on the podcast before. It was episode 260, and it was titled Thirst for Knowledge. And in that particular episode, we discussed the benefits of having an ongoing thirst for knowledge, having a willingness to share and collaborate with others, and going that extra mile when it comes to treating and finding solutions for your patients. Podiatrists are sometimes like Sherlock Holmes. In this episode, we're taking a slightly different approach. We're going to draw on Ben's previous work experience and how this relates to writing, research, and developing a better understanding of specific topics of interest that we have. So, Ben, welcome back to the podcast. That was a long introduction too.
No, but you hit it succinctly. And it's good timing because we have some actual examples of things that you asked me about before that were in the formation stages and now have come to fruition. You had mentioned as a thematic of how is it that we can create a niche that will expand on our thirst of knowledge, make us better practitioners, and potentially develop other areas of expertise if we have an area of passion that we have. Mine happens to be sports medicine. So one example, and I shared a little bit of this with you before, was that I ended up developing, because I have an interest in soccer, playing later in life. And I've always been interested in all the mechanics associated with sports. So I was thinking about the condition of turf toe and how it's just so difficult to get things into cleats that have enough room. And then the problems with soccer cleats themselves, the inherent studs that are right by the ball joint of the metatarsal phalangeal joint that end up catching sometimes on the turf or causing sesamoiditis because you've got that stud directly under the ball of your foot, right under the sesamoid complex. So with the collaboration with industry, I developed a turf toe splint, which I'm proud to say is the top seller on Amazon. I only wish I had developed it. Yeah, I only wish I had developed it when Patrick Mahomes several years ago in one of the Super Bowls had his turf toe injury. And guess what? They showed on national TV the turf toe splint that he had at the time. So mine is not the only turf toe splint. But going down the rabbit hole of what you tasked me to do here today in terms of like taking that idea and then really going the next step, I did a lot of research on what are the history of Morton's extensions and what has been published on arthritis in the big toe. And what I found was there really wasn't a lot published. There was some stuff on the history of the Morton's extension. There was some literature on my PubMed search on midfoot arthritis. And I believe it was actually in Australia that a lot of that research was done. Because we don't have enough here in the US.
It's one of those things that, like even when you mentioned the turf toe splint that you developed and Patrick Mahomes, even my wife knows who he is, by the way. That's how popular he is. But just go back a step, in case we've sort of jumped ahead, when people listening to this episode, don't want you to think, we're talking about doing research to develop a product. We're just talking about doing research in an area that all of a sudden, it could be a patient that's come through your clinic. And you might have a patient, I gave an example before I press record. I said, you might have a patient that comes in who plays soccer, and you might have a bit of an interest in soccer. And all of a sudden you're going, what is the best soccer boot? Or could it be changed somehow? So you go back and do a bit of research on the history of soccer boots and what used to be around in the 70s and 80s and 90s and what's around now. And what are the trends heading into the future? And then all of a sudden you dig really deep into that area and you become extremely knowledgeable in that area. And that could then be a niche that you could talk on. It'd be something that you could write articles on. Or it could be something you're just extremely good at it when it's with your patients. It's not always about just developing a product at the end.
Oh, absolutely. And I wanted to make that hand in hand that doing lay work on the soccer cleats, which I did, and believe it or not, much of that writing is in industry. So when I did my search, there's not a lot of scholarly research on soccer cleats. Simon Bartold has talked about some of the developments he's done with a better soccer boot. You and I have had sidebar conversations
Yeah.
about the problem with soccer boots and how there doesn't seem to be a lot of development. I'm still wearing my Copa Mundials just because of the sturdy base, and it's got a little bit wider toe box than some of the other soccer cleats that are out there. But the cheaper cleats in particular can create a lot of pressure and a lot of problems. The interesting part about delving into something like soccer cleats is then you become knowledgeable on the surfaces with which you're using the cleat,
Okay.
about potential injury patterns, not only in the foot, but that can occur in the knee from a cleat that is anchoring too hard. I'm my own sort of test subject in that when I wore a soccer cleat that was designed for a better grass surface on a red clay surface because it had been very hot here in Washington, that soccer cleat grabbed. It was a non-contact injury where that cleat grabbed into the dirt and I ruptured my ACL. It's not a complete tear, but my ACL is now deficient. So all this stuff from my own personal interest and things that happened to me with my own interest in sports medicine fueled my fire to then go in and say, where is the research with this? What are some better ways to do it, both from injury prevention standpoint and performance, because I'm also interested in performance.
But also that information that you gather yourself over a period of time, whether it's months or years of digging into that, that information also becomes very helpful for other, well, for soccer players, for your patients, but also soccer clubs, places where you could go out and speak to clubs and managers and coaches and develop a name for yourself in that specific area.
Yeah, it's like the difference between knowing in the 1970s when we first started talking about the anatomy of a running shoe and pronation and supination and putting your foot in the sand, and this is a pronated foot, to the more nuanced approach that we have now with all the different things with stack height and drop and things of that nature. And that also applies to soccer boots, just continuing that example, and the skill positions and the differences between strikers and defenders. So the deeper you go, the more information you get, the more conversations that start. And then, as we talked about before, when you say, I have a notion to write an article on this, there's places you can submit in trade journals. It doesn't always have to be scientific peer reviewed. It can just be editor reviewed by a trade journal, get published. And then you have another feather in your cap, because that makes you, as Barry Block used to say to me, and I do a lot of writing for Podiatry Management magazine, you go from author to authority on the subject.
Yeah, and I think every podiatrist I know who's normally interesting to talk to is interested in specific areas of podiatry. And I think if you have no interest in any specific area in podiatry and you have no interest, you'll listen to this podcast so far and you've gone, I'm not really, there's nothing that really floats my boat that I'd like to learn more about, then you are a very beige podiatrist and probably boring.
Yeah. And to your point, that is going to translate, because I know that you primarily do a business coaching based podcast.
Yeah.
That is going to lead to you not becoming relevant anymore. They're going to find somebody, and that somebody might be the run retail shop up the street, because they can be knowledgeable and they have the sort of project the confidence because they see a lot of runners.
That is true.
And rightfully or wrongfully, even sometimes dispense medical advisory things that maybe is a little bit out of the scope. And I'm not saying that all run retail does this, but it does happen.
Oh, there was a conversation that came up just recently in some of the Facebook groups. And that was something where there's a particular retail shoe store and they're selling over-the-counter orthotics and they're recommending things to patients. And patients are eating this information up because somebody is giving them the information. So that's why I think it's really important for podiatrists. If you have an interest in running shoes, in sports, pick certain topics and write about it. Get information out there. Do a little bit of research, dig a little deeper. It doesn't need to be a peer-reviewed article. It just needs to be something that we've put a bit of thought into, looked at other people's research, and just give your opinion on it. Doesn't mean your opinion is always right, but it's still your opinion.
Absolutely. There was a doctor, I was listening to another podcast with Jack Schubert, and he referred to one of his mentors, Ted Hansen. And his whole thought process was that when you have clinical case series in your own practice, like let's say I'm trying out a new soccer cleat or a turf toe splint or a new intervention, a way of doing something, different protocol, that can become as valuable both for yourself and to your colleagues, sometimes as an official IRB study. Now, it may not have an IRB attached to it and have that extra weight, but let's look at some of the literature, for instance, in pediatric situations where you're doing pediatric research on, let's say, Sever's disease. You have so many confounding variables in the pediatric research on activity level and different variables that make research in and of itself, even if it is peer-reviewed IRB, difficult to collate. But if you have a small case series, that can have its own intrinsic value. So just re-emphasizing your point in another way.
Yeah, and some clinics do, and some podiatrists will attract a certain type of patient with a particular problem. And you may be seeing more of that particular problem in your clinic than anybody else. And then if it interests you, I think you should dig deeper and become a bit of an authority in that particular area. Even if you never get up and speak about it, but at least writing about it is going to be beneficial for the profession, but also for other patients that are looking for that information.
It's all part of that see one, do one, teach one, so that eventually you find yourself on the podium. There's been a lot of industry information dispensed, for instance, on another area of interest I have, pulse electric magnetic fields. A lot of that, Tyson, is industry driven. Who has sat down, though, and looked at the meta-analysis papers? And you're not trying to sell a box. You're trying to find out more about the technology and about the potential for that. For those that don't know what it is, we've been using bone stimulators that here in the United States have been FDA approved since the late 1980s. But looking at new applications of where that technology could go. And as one thing leads to another, when I started doing the podcast that I have, where I have all kinds of experts in different areas, you eventually run into people that are doing a lot of IRB research. And so I proposed to a recent guest that I had, Dr. Patrick DeHere out in Indianapolis, who has about 30 studies going on with his residents. Hey, I'd like to do maybe something on looking at Sever's disease and the role that PEMF might have on this transient osteopenia that occurs with this growth plate anomaly and what that might do to help out this condition. And so now we're going through the process. So again, to your point, you don't have to go to that end line of, let me do a study on it, but at least try to put together a case series, write an editorial letter to whatever journal that you look at or whatever website forum that you're involved with.
I think it's one of those things you should put it out there. If you have thoughts or ideas, I think it's important to share them with the profession. But I also think that people reading them, if you have an opposing thought, be polite. If you don't agree, just say, oh, I don't agree with that. You might want to send the message to them privately that you don't agree, but don't be a complete tool in a forum, which then puts other people off of sharing their ideas. And I know a lot of podiatrists who have got some really good ideas in certain areas, but they won't share it because they're afraid when they do, they're going to get attacked by other people. I sometimes feel some podiatrists feel like somebody else might be stealing their limelight when they share something that's actually of interest.
Absolutely. What I find of taking that chance of somebody else might pick up on that idea is that when you commit to becoming an authority on a particular subject and putting it out there, that leads to other connections and other challenges which are going to make your ideas stronger. It's like when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, right? If you had just John Adams doing it without Ben Franklin, these opposing personalities, you're going to come up with a weaker document.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, so that sort of thing I agree on, that if you have your own opinion or your own views and you share that, you've got to be open that other people may have an opposing view, or they might have some different ideas. But if they collaborate in a professional way, not in a negative or nasty way, I think the end result is going to be a lot better.
Yeah, yeah. And like you've already implied, leave your ego at the door. Be curious, be open, and for heaven's sakes, this whole concept of cognitive dissonance that occurs with, I'm going to just take an example on climate. We see different things happening in the climate. Yeah. We have all our own observations about it. Science has told us there are increasing temperatures. We've had some measures and so forth. Well, regardless of what political spectrum you are, and sort of making observations is what we do as scientists, what we do as clinicians, doesn't mean you're saying that, oh yeah, this is the way we should be abandoning fossil fuels and doing hydroelectric. Doesn't mean that. Doesn't mean also that you're questioning somebody if there's a God or not that is ultimately controlling what happens with climate anyway. You're just making observations about what you're seeing. Don't have this sort of disconnect and just be totally linear and siloed off that, hey, I've got my own viewpoint and that I'm only going to cherry pick the things that fit my skeleton and algorithm. And what you say doesn't agree with me, so I'm going to just cast it aside.
So I thought now would be a perfect time to just dive in and remind everybody that if you're looking or considering a podiatry business coach, before you reach out to some of the larger coaching companies, please go to my website, tysonfranklin.com, and read through the coaching section. You'll see I've got a model there called the Thriving Podiatry Business Model. And after you read through everything, there's also a link to my online calendar. From there, we can organize a 30-minute Zoom call. We'll have a bit of a talk. I'll explain the Thriving Podiatry Business Model in a bit more detail. And you may find just after that call, that is all you need just to give yourself a little bit of guidance. But if you want to take it further, I can give you more information. So please go to my website, tysonfranklin.com, and I'll look forward to talking to you soon. Okay, let's get back to the interview. Yeah, I spoke about that. I just finished a recent 2-day live podiatry business reboot. And one of the things I spoke about was confirmation bias, where some people already have an idea in their head and they look for evidence to prove that idea is right. And any new information that comes in that may be an opposing view, instead of just looking at it and saying, hey, maybe there could be some information here, they just reject it completely. And you see this in political parties all the time. You can have someone that, well, we'll talk American politics since you're on here. You've got the Democrats and you've got the Republicans. And there'd be some Democrats that, or Republicans, it wouldn't matter who they put as their leader, there would still be people that would have voted for him. Wouldn't have made any difference whatsoever. So I think that happens across the board. And I think you've got to ask yourself, when you think a certain way, why do you think that way? But always keep your mind open to other ideas.
And I'm smiling because you brought up the point confirmation bias, which is just so important. And I had a situation when I was doing my thesis at Indiana University, my undergraduate. I had a thesis which was using sports as a vehicle for mainstreaming for folks that had physical or mental disabilities, that had challenges. And I did a lot of field research, a lot of different papers that led up to this culmination thing that, since I wasn't a musician and didn't have a senior project to do a piano recital, I said, hey, why don't I take a look at people's impressions of an individual that they saw that was in a wheelchair that was doing office work versus a individual that had that wheelchair that was playing basketball. Yeah. Would you have a beer with this guy? Would you drive him home, or him or her home? Those kinds of things, a questionnaire. Well, as it turned out, I had a very small classroom of students that the university supplied me with, let's say 17 students, Tyson. So my number size was small to begin with. So I said, well, why don't I show the clip, the film clip to the group of students, right? The 17 students, have them fill out the questionnaire, and then show them the second clip and have them fill out the questionnaire. Well, do you know, on the panel that reviewed my final project. And this was only like the maraschino cherry on top of the sundae. It was not the main body of the 4 years of what I was doing with my
Yeah.
integrated major program and pre-med and individualized major program. There was a staunch science guy on the committee, and he said, we are not going to graduate this guy because there is confirmation bias in this, in that he showed the same group a film so that would bias their opinion they had already seen instead of having a proper control of another group. But I was literally on the ropes that summer. The solution they came up with is write a paper about all the flaws that you had with your own study. And that's what I did over the summer. And so unceremoniously, I got that degree in the summer instead of the spring, and never went through the whole cap and gown. But that was an important lesson for me on confirmation bias.
I think there's nothing better when you believe something and then all of a sudden you get more information and you're actually open to that information and your belief just suddenly changes. There you go. Oh, that's what I always thought. But because you were open to it, you do it. And I've seen people have arguments over things where one has one view, another podiatrist might have a different view, and they're having a heated debate, but neither of them will budge or take any information from the other. And I'm listening to both of them going, you're both right, but you're also, and where they differed was only a small area, but neither of them would budge. And I think they walk away not learning anything from each other because they weren't prepared to just take in some new information.
And you know what I think the other thing that leads to all these problems with how we are trained in medicine is you look at an area like the airline industry. When something goes awry, okay, they have that black box, right? And the aeronautical division looks in detail about how that accident happened. The first thing that happens, let's say if a podiatrist gets in a malpractice case, and there might be other specialties at a particularly maybe non-podiatry friendly hospital, is they want to hang that podiatrist up on a cross. And in general, the whole perfection in medicine instilled, at least traditionally, from right at your very start of your education track, it isn't looked at in the same way. We're starting to see a few people that are a little more open and brave about presenting their failures, as opposed to every Charcot reconstruction that ended up, at least for the time period that they were following the patient, flawless.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good thing that people show their failures, because that's the only way that we're going to grow.
Oh, definitely. We're all going to make mistakes in areas in our judgment or whatever it is that we're doing. And that's why I think it's always important to be able to get feedback from other people. So if you're going back to the research side of things, if you're doing research in a particular area or you're digging into it and you decide to put your thoughts out there, you've got to be prepared. There may be something you've missed because you're so close to it. So it's good to get other viewpoints coming in.
Yeah. One of the hot topics right now is podiatrists become still owning that space of authorities in gait and locomotion. Yeah. And it doesn't take long to pick up a podcast where you'll hear a chiropractor on a major medical information podcast talking about the benefits of minimalist footwear. And so I scratch my head and say, that's great for that particular chiropractor, but we're having more podiatrists in the mainstream podcasts and not just the sort of podiatry-centric podcasts talking about gait. I mean, they exist. It's just that the industries and some of the health professions that are very closely aligned with industry have sometimes superseded the traditional podiatry, where we own that space in the 1970s. And now there's challenges from every which way. You walk down the street, there's another physical therapy clinic opening up, a run gait center, et cetera. And they can do good work, and nothing against what they're doing. It's just that we have to be better. We have to go down and dig deeper and not just be looking at research from the 1980s.
But that's why I think it's important. We need to get information out there. And if you don't like to write, shoot a video. if you can gather the information and you're fantastic in front of a camera, then get in front of the camera and actually talk about what you've learned and share that with the world. And yes, you may get some negative feedback, but if you believe in what you're doing and you're open to other people's thoughts and ideas, that can only be beneficial for the profession. And I think we said this a couple of weeks ago when we were talking. If every podiatrist just wrote a little bit more, and Ivan Bristow, we had the same conversation. If every podiatrist just wrote one blog article a month with a few thoughts and ideas of some research that they've done in the area that they like, we would just, the rankings, we would just be turning up everywhere. You looked, and podiatrists would be getting invited on more podcasts to talk.
Yeah, absolutely.
I set a goal a couple of years ago, about 5 years ago. I said, I'm going to be on 100 podcasts this year. I want to be a guest on 100 podcasts. And I didn't hit my goal. I think I did about 72 or 77 podcasts for the year. And majority of them were business related, but not all of them. Some of them were lifestyle podcasts, some were financial podcasts, and some were health podcasts. But just by getting out there, and it was surprising the amount of people I spoke to and the hosts who all said, I've learned so much more about podiatry just by having this conversation with you. I didn't realize how interesting it was. So I think the podiatrists put themselves there, they become an authority, and then try and get in the media, whether it's on a podcast or something that just promotes the whole profession.
Yeah. And to your point, I haven't made a number goal, but I will see something that is an area of interest. If we're talking about footwear, I'll see somebody that in my research that does a very nice synopsis of footwear that I might have an interest in a particular sport. And then they have like a travel blog of writing about travel and footwear while you're traveling, et cetera. And so I said, boy, that guy's a good writer and he's got some good ideas. Why don't I contact and see if there might be a mutual interest? And Tyson, as for every 10, 20 of those letters, you might get one person respond. And unless it's through a friend of a friend or a colleague of a colleague, where there's a vested symbiotic thing, like if you know a doc and I know a doc and we mention and we already have that connection, they're going to be interviewed on your show or vice versa because of that trust in the colleagues that you're dealing with. But if you're just contacting somebody in lifestyle that already has a successful blog, and I did this also, by the way, with a cycle podcast because I'm very interested in cycling. So I contacted an Irish former pro cyclist that was a former lawyer that now does a cycle podcast called The Road Warrior. And I haven't heard back from him. But at the same time, I'm still going to listen to his podcast because I pick up different things, different strains of thought. Yeah. That if you're passionate about cycling like I am, that's just going to help you think through some things, sometimes even in a more tangential way, just a better way of expressing yourself about a particular thought process or sport or how you relate an interaction or an incident.
Yeah. If people want to get on other people's podcasts, there's the right and a wrong way to do it. And the best way of doing it is if you're ever going to go to someone's podcast, and I found when I would reach out to people and say, hey, I'd like to come on your podcast, I would probably get a hit rate of about 4 out of 5 would say yes. And it's purely, you take a step back and the idea is to, what is the benefit to their listener by having you on there? Not what the benefit is to you. For example, so I get people approach me all the time and say, hey, I've invented this product on your podcast and talk about it. And I go, well, you could. I said, well, what I'd like to know is more about who are you? I want you to come on the podcast as you, and I want to share your story. And then we'll talk about how you got to that idea of coming up with that product. You sharing that part of your story is more important to the listener than the actual product itself. Then you can promote the product at the end.
Yeah. And that authenticity comes through in your podcast because I've listened to a number of your podcasts, and one's podcasts that I think are very strong promote that parlay and interaction. And it's not just sort of, for lack of a better word, either an infomercial. Yeah. And I've been on webinars that are just that, just an infomercial. And although you can get some exposure to a product that might benefit your practice, and that can lead to, okay, then you sample the product and say, oh yeah, that's at a price point that my patients can afford or whatever. it's not the best service for that particular time frame in terms of collegial interaction.
So, hey, while we're talking about promoting things, what are you up to? What have you got happening at the moment?
Yeah, so I have the podcast Fit Foot You,
Fit Foot You.
So I'm still doing that podcast. I'm dumping some of them to Spotify, which has gotten, as you probably have encountered yourself, sometimes more elaborate as they change, go from Anchor to Spotify. And so it's a whole process, right? These podcasts where you're trying to be on YouTube, and then for me, I also dump to Spotify. So I have the podcast where I have the athletes, coaches, people like yourself, other physicians, podiatrists, and I do other disciplines. And sometimes people that I've had contact with earlier in my career that I circle back to. And it makes, obviously, you a better communicator by doing a podcast. It's a constant way to sow ideas and vet the ideas with your colleagues. The other thing that is happening is we have a standalone through my Academy of Podiatric Sports Medicine, an event that's happening in September, and that will be in Columbus, Ohio. And I don't know if you're going to be in the States and if that's going to fit your time frame. But
no, I'm not going to be in the States until late October. Normally it's early October, and I would have been able to catch that event beforehand. But no, I'm going to be there late October.
But I will invite you specifically to the Biomechanics Summit. Then we're going to try to open it up to have a little more surgical biomechanics, so the mechanics of surgery and how it integrates into the pre-op considerations for the mechanics of the patient walking and the post complications that can happen in the sequence of the procedure. So we're going to try to open it up to that a little bit as well as footwear and sports footwear.
If anyone wants to get links to those areas, what's the best way to do it? Do you know the links off the top of your head? Or
Well, so you can go to the American Academy of Podiatric Sports Medicine. Reedy Yates is the executive director, and both for the live standalone meeting, and we have picked a date of March 25th of 2025. So that will run as a companion set of information that we're going to try to integrate the live meeting with. So we'll bring up some topics, ... to be continued, and then have some other speakers that haven't had a chance to sort of voice their thoughts at the podcast that we're going to do virtually. And so that you can do from the comfort of your home.
And which is good for people that aren't able to travel, work commitments, family, life. You can't always get away. So, that'd be helpful.
Yeah. And one of the things that I've been trying to promote both with this virtual summit and with the Academy is to try to get more international. It's been hard. It's a challenge. I mean, folks tend to be siloed up. You know, the folks that you know in your region, the folks in England know the folks that they know in England. And sometimes it rotates around that. When you get obviously enough of a name for yourself, you're an international vetted speaker that everybody wants to get. But I would like to see more collegial interaction amongst attendees from other areas of the country, because there's so much cross-pollination that could occur.
It's always good too when you see fresh speakers on the circuit. When you've had your older crusty ones that have been around for a while, and the same people that pop up at the same conferences talking about the similar stuff, but they put a different color lipstick on it and they put it out there. So it's always good. And that's why it comes back to what we were originally talking about, where if you have an interest in an area, like I said, it doesn't need to be a big peer-reviewed, researched article where you're going to gain a qualification at the end of it. It's just something that interests you, I will guarantee will interest other podiatrists. And if you're the one that's put the work into it and done a little bit of research and reading and put something forward, then that will put you ahead and maybe of interest to speak at upcoming conferences as well.
Absolutely. And I can be a testament to that. That's happened where I've written a piece and then eventually shopped that idea to a conference. And if it was felt that it fit in with the schematic of the conference, the next thing you know, you're up on the lectern talking about that subject.
Yeah. And it saves people time. That's the big thing. It's like, see, my interest is the business side of podiatry and just the business world. I love it. I get off on it. I love the marketing side of things. So I spend a lot of time and effort reading and researching in that area so everybody else doesn't have to. I can then present and do it like a reboot over 2 days and provide all this information that people can just come in for 2 days, take what they need from it, and then go back to their clinics and then just kill it. But you've got to have an interest in that area.
To your point on the reboot and the latest fresh information, like there was just some hot topic about Sanjay Gupta talking about the connection of the feet and dementia and the mind, and how the proprioception, working the foot muscles and working that proprioception in the foot can then lead to a better overall neurologic status and less sort of degradation as we age. This is a topic that's been talked about for a long time, but suddenly somebody comes up who everybody is familiar with their name, everybody sort of jumps in on that bandwagon. But what I was going to say about your reboot is that and we were talking about this topic today. I interviewed a massage therapist, and we were talking about the importance of touch and how critical that connection point is with patients. Listening actively, all those initial steps, but then just simple touch, not just checking the pulse and then moving on to explain about the X-ray or the ultrasound or the solutions, but having that more active component that can thaw through all the things that the patient is carrying, the baggage that they're carrying as they step into your office and are about to walk out because they don't want to pay the $75 copay or whatever is irking them at the moment. We had a patient today that we had an extended visit with another patient that needed a lot of care. She came a little bit early, finished her portal early, and a senior just looked her way. She was looking at a picture I have of Amsterdam, and the patient, in this case, thought, is she staring at me? Well, within a minute, and our staff tried to identify, we're going to bring it back. It was just 15 minutes past the scheduled time. She said, I don't feel comfortable here. I mean, my goodness, that's a new one. And she thought that the patient was staring at her. She was just looking at the photograph behind her, sitting up. So it's certainly a lot of different things that can happen in the space of your office, but the more we establish that early connection with our patients, right? And it almost validates, when I have this massage therapist on today, it validates the importance of establishing that early connection. It reminds me, yeah, I need to touch and make sure the patient feels comfortable and so forth. And then we start talking about the research about touch. When we start talking about NBA players that give each other a pat on the back because there's no time to communicate in the heat of an NBA battle, those teams tend to perform better just because of that intrinsic thing that is so important for our social interaction.
Even when we're in the gym in Muay Thai, after you've held pads for the other person, when the round finishes, you hit to indicate that's the end of the round. Well done. Without saying well done, by hitting it, it's just like, you did good. And then you get ready to do yours, and then you do exactly the same thing back. So it is. But it's quite interesting when you said about touch and then doing research on that. A lot of people, when they think I'm talking about dig just into the business side of things and I'm only reading about how to make money, no. I don't really read much about how to make money. I read a lot about communication skills. And when you become a better communicator, it just solves so many problems in life and in business, not just with patients, but with your family, with friends, with your children. So when you were talking about touch and then reading a little bit about a touch and then digging into the research of touch, it just makes you a better podiatrist.
Yeah, I'm going to give you one more example that's saying the same thing in another way of what we've been talking about all evening here. I was looking at this little short clip that somebody was talking about, and they were kind of a B actor. And Clint Eastwood had hired this actor. I don't even remember the guy's name. That's how much of a B actor he was. But Clint Eastwood had him audition for a movie. And so Jack Nicholson liked this other actor that was auditioning for Clint Eastwood's movie. And his piece of advice to this actor was, he said, do more than what's required.
Oh, yeah.
Do more than what's required. And at first he said to Nicholson, he said, you're a big screen star. You just go and you're in the movie. I've had more audition experience. But Jack, what's your advice? And he said he went through that Tyson. He set up the lighting for his little clip that he sent for the director. He got the lighting right. He played around with his costume, worked a little bit more on his inflection, and he got the part. So I think that's what we have to charge ourselves. Do more than what's required. If we go into it and we're thinking about like change healthcare, it just torpedoed all my accounts receivable for the last year. And if you go in with that attitude, the woe is me kind of thing. Who was that character in Winnie the Pooh that was always woe is me?
Eeyore was
yeah,
yeah, woe is
yeah.
me.
So if you go into that and you don't, that is going to determine your ability to do more than what's required. Because if you're going to just do what's required, if you already have that kind of beaten down mindset.
Yeah, it's like some people in life, they do the bare minimum to get by in life, and then they wonder why life just passes them by because they're only putting in a minimal amount of effort. I had a friend who was a public speaker, and he said, when you're doing public speaking, he said, arrive early, see if you can help set up. When you're finished, hang around, talk with everybody afterwards. Do they need a hand putting everything away? They said, you will be invited back to speak again. They said, whereas the speaker who rocks up just when they need to, jumps up on stage, does their thing, and then just shoots through and has no interaction with anyone, they only ever get invited once. So
yeah, that's a great piece of advice.
And I say the same thing when you go to an event. When you go to an event, don't just leave as soon as the event's finished. Plan that you're going to leave really late that night when everyone's gone to bed or the next day. Just stay and enjoy the atmosphere. And that was one of the things from the reboot that just finished. There were 12 people there, and it was fantastic that when it was all said and done and everyone's hanging around and they're having a few beers afterwards and everyone's laughing, it was great. The amount of them that came up to me and said, this was fantastic. This is the type of event I want to do more of. These smaller, close-knit events where we actually get to know each other and we get to talk and we can openly share an idea. And even if someone has an opposing view, we're laughing about it. You're not being attacked with this. It's some of the really big conferences just get too overwhelming.
Yeah, that's transformative. I love that idea. But it reminds me of the perfect is the boxing match. Even as sometimes I'm doing the podcast, even if it's somebody that I'm friendly with, you're interacting with that person one-on-one. You're getting the flow. It's like the boxing match. You're throwing a jab here, a left. You don't want a roundhouse right away. You want to have, and in a podcast, you're trying to draw out information. But it's like you're saying, the definitive round is that last flurry of punches where you might get 20% in that first 3 hours of the event, and that last hour when the connections form that are going to be transformative and get you invited back or get you to be interviewed for a book or something like that.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. Okay, Ben, if people want to reach out to you, anyway, what are the best contact details for you?
Yeah, so you can contact me through any questions you have about one of my videos on my podcast by just commenting on them. Direct communication, benpearl@gmail.com is my email if you have any ideas you want to share. And I'd love to have clinicians that are interested in sharing information. And then a third way to get in touch with me is through Facebook, Ben Pearl, and then on LinkedIn, Dr. Ben Pearl. So those would be several ways to get a hold. And then I hesitate in today's world to give out my phone number, but if a colleague wants to have a conversation, I'm happy to do that once I realize it's not an AI-derived colleague and a real person.
You don't want to give your phone number to too many stalkers. Because I don't think there've been any listening to this podcast. It's only nice podiatrists listen to this podcast. Yeah. So if you're talking to a fellow podiatrist and you want to figure out, are they a nice podiatrist or an evil podiatrist? All you do is ask them a question. Hey, by the way, do you listen to the Podiatry Legends podcast? If they go, oh no, I don't listen to that. You know they're evil. That's my evil podiatry test.
That's awesome.
And
well,
so,
should I give you the virtual Muay Thai?
Fist punch.
Yeah.
So thank you for coming back on here. It's been fantastic, and I look forward to talking again soon.
Yeah, I loved it. Thanks so much, Tyson.